Hi all, my name is Jonathan Kung. I co-founded the DAO Governance Framework, and really glad that you guys are here with us to talk about decentralized governance. It's one of the hardest topics, I think, to talk about because it's so fuzzy. It's something that's very hard to define and something that's very hard to build around. But at the same time, it is basically, I think, a lot of the reasons why we're all here. The problems that we're trying to solve are social, and the question of all the algorithms that we've been building, it's basically and how we're actually deciding how successful we are is based on how these technical solutions are actually affecting the social. So I'm really happy to be amongst these wonderful people today. To start talking about these questions about decentralized governance and where we actually are with that discussion. DAOs are are the kind of application that we've all been talking about, but at the same time, it's there's a lot of differences between how decentralized governance and DAOs actually tend to work. So that being said, we're going to dive into some of these questions of where we actually are, where the problems are, and some of the solutions that we've been exploring, but it's an open question, so excited to invite you all to engage in this conversation with us. So first question is to the panel, do DAOs exist?
Introductions first?
Huh?
Should we do it?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. First of all, each member, please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff. I am a founding member of ENS Labs. I've been with ENS since 2017. If no one knows, ENS is a blockchain naming system. In terms of like governance and DAO governance, ENS has gone from a protocol that's been, completely managed by the team and been a multi-sig to moving to systems like our DAO in 2021. And since then, in the last couple of years, we've gone through a whole head of kind of dealing with the idea of decentralized governance, how to manage the protocol, how to manage the kind of protocol treasury. And so I'm very happy to chat about these things today.
Oh, now it works. All right, well, thank you all for having me. My name is Anke Liu. I am the Senior Program Manager at the Stellar Development Foundation, which is a nonprofit that guides the development and growth of the open source Layer 1 blockchain networks of Stellar. And so at SDF, I really focus on leading the Stellar Community Fund, which is an open application awards program that supports developers and startups building on Stellar with funding they need. So in 2023, we've already given out over almost $12 million in XLM to over 150 projects to really support our new native smart contracts platform as well. And it's pretty exciting, so different from typical grant of grant programs. It actually takes in input from the community for both award allocation, for project support, as well as for governance. And so we've actually been working with a company called Block Science on some of these innovative mechanisms for voting mechanisms, and I'm happy to dive into some of those later today. So I'll give it to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Mariah. I'm a co-founder of Gyroscope, which is a new stablecoin that actually we just launched last week. I hope you have the chance to check it out. It aims to be a stablecoin that puts risk control of other stablecoins on autopilot. And part of this stablecoin is that it's doing sort of this risk management on-chain in a non-custodial and decentralized way, and that involves also having a decentralized governance system. And we thought quite a lot about kind of the challenges of decentralized governance and adding in various user protections into governance. And so, yeah, quite excited to talk about decentralized governance today.
Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Jelani Clark. I'm one of the executive leads at DeSci World, as was mentioned before, and DeSci World is essentially a platform that helps bring people into the decentralized science space. So DeSci stands for decentralized science. It's a new niche that is coming up in the Web3 space, and the whole goal there is to help promote accessibility, security, asset management, and bring all of the ethos of what Web3 has to offer to the scientific realm. Much like the creator economy, there's a lot of exploitation that exists in science, and there's a need for a more equitable system. And I think Web3 is right in line for allowing that to happen. So at DeSci World, again, our goal is to bring more people into this space. We also help develop technical frameworks that allow for interoperability between different DeSci toolings that can be leveraged by formerly trained scientists like myself, but also science-curious participants to then become stakeholders in what science has to offer in the world. And so alongside that, we also deal with organizing communities and developing governance frameworks around what are to become real-world assets from science. And I think this is very on brand with what we're talking about today. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation.
Thanks, all. So yeah, now to start off with the first question, do DAOs exist?
Mic drop.
Mic drop. I think it depends on how you define it. So if a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, I think we definitely have decentralized organizations, but the autonomous part is, the definition that we can maybe argue about. With the ENS DAO, I feel like it definitely exists it helps to deal with decisions like upgrading the protocol and managing funds, but obviously there's this whole issue of things where how do we actually do the decision making and put the vote on chain? All of this stuff is completely out of the DAO, and it's kind of social processes that we put in place to discuss and make decisions. And so at that point, it's not autonomous anymore. We're just kind of doing normal governance. But yeah, I do think they exist, but I don't think it's as, the days of the DAO, thinking of everything being controlled by a machine, that kind of thing. We still have a long way to go before that.
Yeah, I kind of want to add on to that too. I mean, we know that decentralized organizations, they exist, right? But I feel like the automation, or at least like full on-chain automation, is something that's still in an evolutionary stage. But I kind of want to also take a step back and think, is like maximizing decentralization, is maximizing, I guess, full on-chain automation, is that our goal? Is that what we want? And so kind of thinking back to our goals and desirables, especially for SCF, it is to provide like effective and a fair funding allocation, and also growing our community. And then what are some of those challenges that we deal with? And one of those that we also see is having like voter apathy. And voter, kind of fatigue. And so thinking about that, okay, how are we going to solve for that? Is to like build more like outcome-oriented systems, is to build systems that have incentives that are more aligned for the betterment of the overall, I guess, organization or DAO, as well as. So I think there are some opportunities there that we can still leverage into creating systems, as well as those, and to create actual like more of an environment that. Nurtures like intrinsic motivation as well. And then we also can see, well, like we know that ecosystems and we know that organizations, they change from time to time, like new features are added, new members come in. We should also build, not just having like a single system for all this time, but actually build around like also an adaptive governance model. And I think kind of embodying these types of, features, I think, is very important to kind of move forward.
Yeah, I think DAOs exist. But I think it depends on what you really mean when you talk about like what the words are. I think we can point at some things, if they are like, we can point at things that are kind of like DAOs, but you can and should like question like what does decentralization mean? Is something actually decentralized? And there's some cool work looking into like how do you actually measure things like that. There's a couple different meanings of autonomy. One meaning is like that something happens like automatically, And yeah, a lot of DAOs aren't kind of like at that stage for sure. But another meaning of autonomy is that you kind of have something that like exists by itself, that kind of like doesn't exist within another entity or kind of within another country or something. And we do have organizations that kind of fit that bill. And the third is like actually organization, and kind of like the best DAOs, so to say, are actually like very not organized, I guess. They're kind of more like online communities or something, as opposed to like a formal organization. But if you think of it from like this perspective, which I think a lot of people do when they talk about DAOs, then yeah, these things can exist.
So I want to kind of double click on what Jeff said, but also what you said. So I think depending on what stratification you want to qualify a DAO, and think on the most case, I would say no. You do have distributed or decentralized organizations, but the automation has not been there. And I think depending on where you exist within the Web3 universe, the likelihood of you becoming autonomous wavers. So if you're dealing with something that is fully on-chain, that can be governed exclusively by smart contracts, then sure. But as DAOs start to shift and mature into things that affect real world change and deal with impact and deal with individuals, then you start to move away from the capacity of being autonomous, because you have to have that off-chain bridge and that reality breaking bridge. And at this point, we don't have systems that do that. The system that does that is the individual. And as soon as you have individuals, then you have capture. And so to your point, I think, yes, there are examples of where you can have autonomous actions, and depending on how you want to structure that. But overall, with the colloquial terminology of a DAO, I don't think we have DAOs quite yet.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I guess I wanted to further the conversation around, so obviously we're still trying to explore the space, and the ways that we've defined centralization and decentralization is a pretty sterile definition in itself, right? So for example, it's like if you talk about, like, there are mangoes and not mangoes, you're still thinking about mangoes, you know what I mean? So we've kind of brought up certain topics, like Anka had mentioned, adaptive governance, for example, and a lot of the other panelists have brought up. It's just this ongoing conversation. We have certain bits of the automation somewhat figured out, but the idea is we're still really trying to push the boundary here, because there's nothing that's really generalizable quite yet. So as we kind of push these boundaries, like, what do you think are the main pain points in terms of what needs to be better defined to actually make decentralized autonomous organizations, for example, more sustainable?
So I think the first one is to define the nomenclature. So we talk about, and Web3 really likes to deal in polarizations, in dichotomies, especially early on. So you had this thing like fully decentralized versus centralized, or permission versus non-permission. And I think as the space starts to mature, what we start to realize is with everything, there's a gradation that exists. Things exist on a spectrum. And so decentralized governance versus centralized governance is not a very productive conversation. And I think what really is the definition here is that decentralized does not mean the antithesis of centralization, but these can be synergistic terms that can complement each other depending on how you apply them. So, and we've had this conversation, but I think you can have examples of decentralization as a fractal of smaller centralized governance frameworks, or smaller centralized frameworks that then amalgamate to give rise to collective governance or decentralization. And I think when we start to have conversations like that and look at it, we start to stop running into friction points where it's like, no, I'm trying to decentralize everything, but it's not working. And we don't want to have super centralization, because that leads to the issues that it has. And we really need to start playing in this gray area. Yeah,
I just wanted to add on to that. I feel like what you said makes a lot of sense in terms of decentralization versus centralization. They're not mutually exclusive, and you have to be able to have this conversation like without thinking in black and white. Like with the DAO for the ENS protocol, it's very clear that we wanted to decentralize the protocol, so ENS Labs and some of the founding members don't have so much control over the protocol. Like if anything happens to us, or if we get pressured from a powerful government or state, then obviously this affects the protocol. So we don't want us to be the entire decision making behind what happens to the protocol. But on top of that, we're also in the best place to make decisions about the protocol because we've been working on this for 6 or 7 years, right? And so being able to, have points of centralization in terms of decision making makes a lot of sense as well because we're in the right, position to make that decision. Just like, Vitalik wants to decentralize himself away from Ethereum, but he's also one of the leading thought leaders in Ethereum. You don't want to just get rid of him because that means he's a point of centralization, right? And so I think you need to really be clear about your definitions and really have a conversation where centralization is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you're talking about. Centralization of, the thoughts and the kind of technical discussions makes a lot of sense because there are only so many experts in the room. But then decentralizing and allowing everyone, the hundreds of thousands of people that have the ENS token are able to make changes if the founding team or some of the technical direction is off, and they can affect the protocol because we are decentralized.
Yeah, and I would like to add on to that. I mean, not everyone needs to be able to vote. Like, not everyone with a computer needs to be able to have, is even set up to be able to participate in a different types of governance, right? And I think something that we've been thinking about at Stellar is really about the reputation-based governance and how can we incentivize intrinsic or really intrinsic motivation, beneficial participation in the community fund, for instance. And so together with Block Science, we've also been building more reputation-based system, and we call it neural governance. So reputation has been something we use it every single day. I mean, we're even all here today because we put our reputation on the line and to put our best foot forward and put our reputation at stake, basically. And so with neural governance, there are different data inputs. For instance, we have expertise. We also have voting history, as well as trust given by others. And these are just some inputs for the initial MVP. And these can also be changed based on a community input. And so then you take something like reputation, but actually build a little bit and work around along its many downsides, which is complexity often. And you can actually measure someone's reputation and has it a voting power into decisions like voting allocation and also on governance proposals as well. So yeah.
Did you have any? Yeah.
I'll add one quick thing there, which is that I think of decentralization the most important part of it around basically decentralization of power if it needs to be exercised, but basically look at how Ethereum works basically. The people who run nodes on Ethereum can coordinate on deciding the chain that is the canonical chain. And if they want to coordinate on a different chain as the canonical chain, they can do that. Now they can also listen to centralizing factors like Vitalik and decide that what he's saying makes the most sense and go with it. But they also have the power to not do that, and they have the ability to exercise that power if they want to, and that's kind of an important feature, I think.
Thanks, Lyle. So what I'm hearing some themes around adaptive governance, for example, because it's just, we don't really know, and the idea is we need to do what works first, right? And as we kind of explore this, I think also we're also in this really weird liminal space at the moment where no one really trusts in anything. So it's very hard but at the same time, these are what we need to actually move things forward, whether it's decentralized or centralized. So there's a lot of different terms that people have been kind of using around trying to establish trust in different ways. For example, there is the word trust, but also on smart contracts and blockchain, we kind of talk about trustlessness, but that can only to the degree that it works, right? And so, and we've also discussed the automation part only covers a very small part of that at the moment. So what other ways can we start to address this idea of trust? So for example, reputation and identity. these are some major, some overlapping terms in terms of how to actually get a community to work together, both even if there's a centralized structure or a decentralized structure. So just wondering what the panel, how the panel has thinks about identity and thinks about trust, and how you guys might build that into your own infrastructure.
Yeah, so I think in the case of decentralized science, it's a little bit different, or it takes on a different spin on it, because we're dealing with the realm of hyper-professional individuals or hyper-specialized individuals. When it comes to something like, and for example, in DeSci you have these things called biofunding DAOs, which are basically collectives of individuals that are pool funds to then fund specific types of research. So they can be longevity-based research, women's health, publishing, and all these kind of things. Now what happens with that is a scientist can come to the DAO and say, propose to get their research topic funded. Now in these DAOs you have people with very different credentials, right? You have the science curious who are just kind of ideating on the process of what longevity could be, and you have individuals who are very highly specialized on understanding what are biomarkers, for example, what are indicators of longevity and what kind of research you need to have. The voting capacity or the influence of these two individuals should be reflective on what they actually understand of something. So if a project comes in and I'm a specialist on this particular topic, well, my voting weight should potentially hold more than somebody who is just tangentially curious. And so when we talk about the idea of weighted governance, reputation-based governance, I think that's an interesting angle to kind of maybe deconvolute what exists around governance and how do we actually drive impact and get rid of a lot of noise that exists in something in a distributed network. If we can differentially weigh how people get to govern and who should govern, that might streamline the process. But again, there's no clear answer. That's certain examples that have worked in our case so far, but this whole realm is very, very new.
Yeah, I think also, in terms of the ENS DAO, we have, so dealing with things like voter apathy, we obviously have delegates, and so that means that anyone can delegate their tokens to someone else. And obviously these delegates are asking for your votes, and so they essentially have this unseen reputation that does exist within the DAO. They have a reputation, and I don't know if that can be quantified, but it'd be helpful if it was. But essentially, if people are contributing to the ENS community, the ENS ecosystem, they have some unseen reputation, the ENS community decides, okay, I trust this person, I'm going to delegate my votes to them, and they trust them to make the right decisions for them. And if they don't do what they, in the future, if their values don't align with that individual, then they can delegate their vote somewhere else. And so I think there's this kind of implicit reputation system that already exists within the DAO. But yeah, it'd be hard if you were just coming to the community, you didn't know too much about it, and suddenly oh, now I've got to distribute my votes to someone, I don't know who. I guess I'll just vote myself, but then I don't know much about ENS, so it's kind of difficult there when you don't already have a reputation system to kind of deal with that kind of thing as well.
I guess one of the benefits to, putting the reputation on, in terms of some kind of framework, and not rely on, the unseen reputation that, all governance systems already use, right? Is that you can, have that inclusivity, especially for new members, so that you don't have to rely on only token holders or only validators, and that there is a clear way for members to actually get their reputation. And there's okay, step one is, for instance, in SCF, step one is to actually verify some identity, some social identity. Step two is to actually gain some Stellar-specific badges, and you can gain some expertise. Step three, etc. Right? So there's different types of steps that you can be more, onboard into new ecosystems, and this inclusivity can have positive effects on, on the overall kind of organization. As I think one of the main issues that we also have in DAOs right now is that the members, the core member group often stays stagnant, right? And all powerful. And this is not something that promotes growth. And I think for success of our entire ecosystem, this inclusivity, this growth is something that we should, promote in decentralized organizations.
And yeah, I think reputation is an important part, but I think it's also something that's very hard to actually like formalize, and even harder to put like into something that's like an on-chain sort of like a governance system. It's always going to be a part of governance, certainly off-chain, and how people kind of like actually coordinate off-chain about what they want to do. But a key part of like why it's so hard to formalize, I think, is that it's hard to judge what's a good decision and what's a bad decision, especially if you're doing it before you can see the effects of those decisions. And even if you can see the effects of those decisions, it's hard to judge.
I think the one thing that we oftentimes don't hear talking about, or we don't speak about, is it's very easy to create a decentralized governance framework. Like, as in, you can allow everybody to have a vote. The reputation piece is actually a proxy of accountability and consequence. And how do you bring consequence to a digital realm where people can be pseudonymous? How do you, so that's the legal system essentially. Outside of Web3, the legal system is what makes sure that if you do something wrong, like I jaywalked the other day, the cops came up and said, you can't do that, right? That's a consequence. On chain, how do you have that? Or in the digital realm, where do you have that? How can I punish somebody for acting wrong? At the level of the chains, you can have slashing of your staked coins and all that kind of stuff. But when you're talking about a DAO that is just a collection of individuals whom I don't know where you are, who's going to come and prosecute you? I think that's the piece that is missing in the governance framework. And so we have all these conversations over and over, and I think the impetus has to become, how do we create proper accountability frameworks? And it could just be that we're not there yet. And once the legal frameworks catch up to NFTs, DAOs, SBTs, and all those kind of things, it'll be a lot easier. But I think that's the conversation. That's where conversation has to go.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to follow up just quickly. It's a great example, basically, of like slashing conditions for like for the network. That's something you can prove that somebody did something wrong. But in governance, you can't really prove that somebody did something wrong, or in most cases, it's very hard to do that. And so that's why this is kind of like a much more difficult problem as well.
Yeah, I like that. I guess I'll build off of that as well. I think, I mean, the complexity of what Araya mentioned also is a real problem in reputation-based systems, right? I mean, most of these processes, they happen inside of our brains like all the time, and how do you actually translate that to a system? I think in neurogovernance that we're working on with block science is one of the innovative kind of systems that is trying to approach that problem and actually trying to put this large isolated system into many different single individual pieces so that you can kind of change piece by piece on how this will even go. And even then it will be a little bit of a time before we get there. But I think like collectively, I think like you're also working on some of the innovative mechanisms. I think collectively we can start to figure out what that is, right? And what you mentioned around kind of the accountability, like having stake. I think that's also what's very important. We should definitely build for this, and because this is also one of the key things that we see that can be a solution to some of the voter apathy and the voter fatigue issues that we have been experiencing, right? I guess like in terms of like reputation-based systems, you have to like build this in, maybe even like having some kind of, if there's some kind of credit system, kind of like you can gain credit by doing beneficial actions and maybe kind of lose credit by kind of doing actions or consecutively that are against, let's say, the organization interest. So that obviously gets pretty complex pretty quickly, but yeah, I would say let's put our minds together.
Sure. Yeah, I think to summarize what I'm hearing, the governance space is just basically a wicked problem. And the idea is there's not going to be a single solution that's going to consistently manage the problem continuously, right? It's an impossibility theorem. So in the same ways that there are even impossibility theorems in algorithms, right? There are certain just problems that we can't solve. So just to understand that we already have these impossibility theorems within the mathematical realm, and we're trying to pair that with this ongoing conversation that can only be sustainable if we continue to have open conversations. So we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to ask the panel basically what you think are the most promising directions to basically advance the conversation of how we intersect the automation and the social.
I mean, I'm probably going to turn that question on its head because I don't think it's possible to automate what we've just talked about. I think reputation it's not just hard to formalize, it's subjective, right? And so what I think is something good, you might think it's something bad. And because it's inherently subjective, I think it's almost impossible to formalize. And so I think to kind of further DAO governance or decentralized governance in general, we just need to understand that this can't be, we can formalize the kind of procedures in place, but knowing that like governance is a social thing and understanding that, we can't automate everything. The things we can automate, like upgrading the protocol on chain or actually delivering funds, but the conversation about who to give funds to, whose reputation is higher, so which projects we should fund, that's a social thing. And we need to take the time to understand that and understand that we're not going to automate that. Even with smart contracts, that we can't automate humans. And blockchains don't give us all the tools we need to do that.
Yeah. Let me just quickly interject there as well. So I guess also thinking about this conversation of like we kind of make this dichotomy between objective and the subjective, where the objective is defined as the absence of the subjective, right? But I don't think that definition continues to really work very well, right? Because we're human. Unfortunately, like Platonian kind of realms aren't really quite accessible. We can kind of posit them and they're idealistic, but as long as the human is involved, the social has to be part of how we define truth. And that is going to evolve generation to generation. So I guess the question is more like, how can we continue to use the algorithms to riff, as opposed to think of it as having to be this objective thing that becomes kind of draconian at times as well. And also, we run into all these problems where it's like, we're not trying to be centralized, we need to adapt. How do we actually interface the code and the social such that it becomes riffable?
Yeah, I think like right now we've been trying so hard to think of the DAO framework as the overarching theme, and the kind of like everything else is like, social governance is a part of that, but I think of it more like, okay, if ENS has, like, in terms of governing ENS, it's like this larger bubble, and then the protocol on-chain governance DAO part is just a small part, and the funding part is another small part. But all of this other stuff, like 80, 90% is all social, and we all need to kind of like know it's subjective and have conversations and be adaptable. And what we can do today to do governance may not work in 10 years when there's not 100,000 people in the ENS community, but 100 million, right? And so we just need to be adaptable in that respect.
I like the notion, I guess, of like really promoting using like adaptive governance and always thinking, okay, like this system might work now for the state that we're in, for the community size that we have, but it might not work for if the community is going to grow, or if like different, factors will change, whether like in the ecosystem or like outside. So, yeah, really trying to promote using, trying to always keep evolving, like choose a system that can change over time, and let's all like innovate together. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think some things can't really be like automated, and we shouldn't expect them to be able to be automated. And that's kind of why governance actually like has a role in like DeFi protocols. But what I think is the important part, I guess, just to come back to that, is that there's a mechanism for decentralizing the power to like actually change these protocols. So it's not just like one centralized team who can like rug the protocol, but instead the power to change the code is decentralized, and ideally there's also new technical like user protections built in. As we kind of talked about a little earlier, like there's less legal protections necessarily in decentralized protocols, and so we have to think about actually building in the user protections that we want at like a technical level. And I think kind of like the right attitude is figuring out how to build in kind of like a fallback mechanism, at least for like how you actually decentralize the governance power on the at least like on the deployed on the chain sort of level, and including like user protections at that level, and then ideally also like everything that happens off chain can adapt as works best depending on who's actually participating.
I think what you guys are doing at Gyroscope is a great example of where I hope the future goes, where you have these concepts of proactive governance built inherently into a system. I think a lot of DeFi and Web3 up to this point has been, let's do something cool, and then let's worry about governance on top of that. And you could swap out governance with multiple different aspects, and that's why we run into these problems. I think, again, as the space starts to mature, having teams and projects and platforms build with governance in mind and with potential conflicts that may arise in mind is the first thing. And the most important thing. So everybody doing due diligence, the next platform you get into, keep that in mind. The other thing is, and this is something that Jeff brought up the other day, let's do away with governance theater and political theater. There's a lot of things that exist in the Web3 space that fall under like governance, but don't actually need to be governed, and it's more like puppeteering and pretending as if we need to govern these kind of things. I think when we start to get rid of noise like that, the truly important things of a particular protocol start to surface. And then we can have much more concise conversations and deployments of technologies or strategies around what do we need to govern. If it's a stable coin, there's very specific things that need to be governed. If it's a refi DAO, then it's this. If it's a DeSci DAO, then it's that. And honing in on what that is instead of just giving everybody the right to vote for whatever reason just because. We'll deal with the issue of poor quorum, so people not actually showing up to vote. And then again, refine what needs to be handled for that particular protocol in that particular example.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think essentially we want to get away from just having to govern everything and getting down to governing as small amount of the protocol as possible, like DAO minimalism, if you will.
All right. Yeah, I think we are at time. So just basically to close, the internet, for example, was meant to be decentralized, but things are more centralized than ever before, right? So it's not just about the tech. And so the ideas that we're trying to bring up is like, well, what if we actually built in the governance ahead of time? Now, obviously, we don't have to think about governance all the time, right? Because it's hard to think about all those constraints at the beginning. But the idea is that really needs to be, it's the elephant in the room that everyone wants to ignore. And if we actually want to build the internet that we want, then we have to be more proactive about how we actively build a decentralized governance into the protocols to prevent the centralization that we've seen so far. So I would give a round of applause to our panel. Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, if you guys want to contact any of us and continue the conversation, just count us down. Thanks.